it's working. It's working. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Chasing Lullabies, the learning program where we try to really open up the Torah text in a deeper, more adult, more wholesome way. And I want to begin this evening by asking you a question about how Jews are perceived. And maybe the first time that I came across this perception of the Jew was in school when I went to a Jewish primary school and a non-Jewish secondary school. When I got to my secondary school, one day someone throws a coin on the floor next to me, and they say, "Go on then, pick it up." What do you mean? Go on, isn't that what you Jews do? You like your things, you like your money. Pick it up. And this image of sort of not just the wealthy Jew, the stingy Jew, but the lying Jew, the scheming Jew, to Jew down someone, to be Jewed, to scheme against someone else, seems to find its roots in the Torah portion that we began last week, or the story that began last week and continue through this week, when forefather Jacob steals the blessings from his brother Esau, poor dear. And we see that his cunning nature extends through into this week's Torah portion. Barry sent me an email earlier asking about other sort of scheming activities in the Torah portion, where it seems like there's an elaborate scheme for taking some of the flocks of his forefather Laban as he puts sticks and other reminders of spots or stripes and causes the flocks to start to produce the animals that are going to be Jacob's wealth and riches. And so we actually have a biblical precedent for this image of the Jew who's always scheming, who's always wanting after something. You throw some money on the ground, they'll run after it. They're always after a quick buck, a quick fix. And I think that kind of maybe in our heart of hearts, we have that sensitivity. Not about us, of course, but them, those sort of like those other sorts of Jews that we sometimes feel ashamed of being part of our nation for whatever reason. Quite good at being anti-Semitic against other Jews, but there's often this sort of sense that there's something a little bit crooked, a little bit not quite right. Some people even try and justify it, that the Jews have always had to be a bit crooked throughout history. That's how we got on in Europe. It wasn't possible to live under the burden of absolutely irrational and persecutory taxation that the non-Jewish landlords placed upon the Jewish populace in Europe unless you were a bit crooked. And that crookedness kind of kept it going, kept it through. Has endured even till today, when there's no necessity to be crooked. But you could argue that crookedness went way back. We learnt last week that there's a name that is given to forefather Israel, whose first name wasn't Israel, but was something else. What was his name? It was a name that his father was quite content to give, but his mother was not so happy. That's what we learnt last week. What was that name? Jacob. Why is Jacob a problem? Jacob means a heel. What's the thing about a heel? A heel is bent, it's crooked. It's not straight, right? That's a heel. So a heel is crooked. And so maybe our crookedness goes all the way back to forefather Jacob, forefather the crooked one. And we asked last week, what does God think about all this cheating, all this scheming that's been happening? Because forefather Jacob, forefather crooked, does actually go and has an experience of God, a prophecy with God. There's the angels going up, the angels going down. And God seems to be entirely silent about this deception and this scheme. Does God not have an opinion upon this? Is there not a certain morality? that needs to be spoken about? And how do we feel about this seeming crookedness? Last week, again, we've put the bookends in place, the goats and coats on the one hand, the goats and coats on the other hand, but we didn't see how to resolve it in the middle. We didn't talk about how can it be that our forefather is the one who cheats. And I'll just finish the question and push the trigger at one more level, which is that there are certain attributes that our forefathers are known for, certain things that sort of typify who they were as people. For forefather Abraham, the attribute that is most identified with him is kindness. He was the forefather who had his tent open on all sides, ready to welcome in the wandering travelers, ready to offer hospitality even on the most difficult day after his circumcision. That's his attribute, is kindness. Then there's forefather Isaac, whose attribute is self-discipline. It's not about necessarily this outpouring of love to others, but it's this self-discipline, this ability to be in control of oneself. Where do we see that? We see that he lay there on the altar, ready to be shechted. You know, we don't think about the binding of Isaac from the perspective of Isaac very often. We're often so caught up in the perspective of Abraham that we sit in Abraham's mind, wondering how can it be that a father would be ready to sacrifice his son? But what's about the perspective of Isaac? He allows himself to be bound, tied to the altar with arms and legs behind each other, ready to be a sacrifice. He's got this self-discipline, this ability to stay in control. What's the character attribute that is most accorded to Father Jacob, Father Crooked? The character attribute that is most associated with Father Jacob is emes, is truth. Truth. Titain emes leYaakov. Give truth to Jacob. That's what it says in the prophet Micah. Truth. The last attribute you'd expect when it comes to Jacob, seemingly, at least from the read that we've had so far, is truth. The great cheat, the great deceiver, who is labeled by his brother in such a way, Ya'akveni zeh pa'amayim, he's Jacob me twice. He's tricked me twice. He's crooked me out of this twice. He's crooked me out of my birthright, and he's crooked me out of my blessing. He's the person, he's the forefather that holds up truth. That's a good spin. They should hire Micah in Downing Street, I tell you that. So what's going on? So 3 questions we asked. 1, what does God think about Jacob's deceit? 2, how do we relate to what it means to be a part of this people that is known for deceit? 3, how do we square up the understanding that Jacob is actually a man of truth with his seeming presentation here that he's a man who's crooked, who's not straightforward, who is a bit of a heel? Fair questions? Okay. Let's do this. Let's do this, guys. So we've got 3 parts to today's workshop. The first part is to look at the actual story of Jacob and see that what goes around comes around. That even though we don't have an explicit mention from God, we don't have some sort of verse telling us that God chastises Jacob, we understand that something is going to happen in Jacob's life. The reverberations of the deceit of his brother are going to reverberate throughout his life, and we're going to see those start to happen from the very beginning of the parsha that we just read. We're then going to move on to the next part, which is to see how we see a resolution to these issues. We're going to find some sort of happy resolution. And then the final part of today's shiur, or not shiur, I don't know, workshop discussion will be, we're going to look as to what it is that Jacob does to transform himself from being a man who is maybe struggling with this character attribute of deception and transforming himself into a person who really can be straightforward and true. And those will be sort of like the 3 parts of today's presentation. The only final thing to notice is that I had a wonderful text from, I hope he doesn't mind me saying, from Jonathan this week, who referenced some amazing connections between the ideas that we're sharing today and also the Haggadah, and the Megillah, so the Esther story, the story of Esther and Mordechai. There are some unbelievable textual parallels between the story over here about Jacob and the story over there about Mordechai. And so I'm going to try and slip in a few parallel understandings of what's going on. So we're going to look at this really from three perspectives. Last week, we looked at it from Rebecca's perspective. We saw that what did she have in mind? She had in mind to try and activate her son, to make her son stand up for himself, to become the doer rather than simply the passive actor. That plot, that idea, that plan, that seemed to misfire. But that was Rivka's perspective. That's what she wanted to achieve. So we've put Rivka's perspective on one side. Today we're going to look at it from two other perspectives. We're going to look at it from Jacob's perspective, and we're going to look at it briefly from Mordechai's perspective at this story. Next week, spoiler alert, we'll look at it from Rachel's perspective, and we'll leave with a cliffhanger as to what Rachel's part is in all this at the very end of today. Okay, so let's begin. In the parsha that we just read, or would have read had we been in shul, but welcome back anyone who wants to come this weekend. We're open again as of Wednesday morning. So we described a seemingly not particularly rabbinic meeting between Rachel and Jacob. Let's just dive into the text where right now and look at that rather not rabbinic meeting. So we need to share a screen. And where are we? Here we are. So we're going back to Genesis 29. Fine. So Genesis 29, and we have the meeting between Jacob and Rachel. Jacob resumed his journey and came to the land of the Easterners. There before his eyes was a well in the open. Three flocks of sheep were lying there beside it, for the flocks were watered from that well. The stone on the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the stone would be rolled from the mouth of the well, and the sheep watered. Then the stone would be put back in its place on the mouth of the well. Just a slight internal question whilst we're reading this. It says there were three flocks of sheep by the well. It's a seemingly irrelevant, mundane detail that does almost nothing to the story. But just keep in the back of your minds where else we might find three flocks of sheep. We're already starting to hear the end in the beginning. But anyway, so we've got the shepherds there. And Jacob said to all the people that gathered there, so my friends, where are you from? And they said, we're from Haran. And that's exciting for Jacob because Jacob's been going to Haran. His mother's told him, run away to Haran. Go and get a wife for yourself from my brother's house. Don't take from the Hittites. Don't take from other women. Don't marry out. Marry in. Go back to Haran. So he says to them, do you know Lavan, the son of Nachor? Do you know Lavan? That's who I'm searching for. They said, yes, we do. So he's excited. Is he well? They answered, yes, he is. And there is his daughter Rachel coming along with the flock. So then Jacob's kind of wondering. He said, it's still broad daylight, too early to run out the animals. So just water the flock and then go off and let them graze. But they said, we cannot until everyone's rounded up because the stone is too big. Then the stone is rolled off the mouth of the well and we water the sheep. So this stone was a massive stone. It takes all the different shepherds to gather around, to all lifted together to let the stone off the well and water the flocks. And whilst he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's flock, for she was a shepherdess. Here comes Rachel onto the stage of history. And here's the very exciting, the dramatic, the romantic, almost a superhero moment. And when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his uncle Laban, and the flock of his uncle Laban, Jacob went up and rolled the stone off the mouth of the well with superhuman strength. Normally this would take all the gathered shepherds to roll the stone off, but here Jacob does it in one fell swoop, and he watered the flock of his uncle Laban. Vayishak Yaakov l'Rachel, and maybe slightly unrabbinically, then Jacob kissed Rachel. Vayisa is kolo vayevk, and he lifts up his voice and he cries. Slightly interesting sequence of events. Initially, he kisses her, he falls in love with her. He's taken aback. This beautiful woman who might be the fulfillment of his journey. There she is, and then he lifts up his voice and he cries. So, first question to you tonight: why is he crying? How do you read this? Why is he crying?
Because he's so moved because he loves her.
Right. So are these happy tears or these sad tears?
He's happy, yeah.
Yeah, these seem like happy tears. The surface, like this, the simple explanation of the verse is he's just moved, so overwhelmed with joy and happiness that he cries. You know, you cry under the chuppah. Why do you cry under the chuppah? Not because you're a crybaby, not because you're sad. I mean, we hope not. What was I thinking? No, you don't do that. You cry under the chuppah because you're overwhelmed with joy. But the Medrash over here on this verse tells us a different story about these tears. So here's Rashi, who quotes a Medrash, who quotes from the Medrash about this, and he gives two explanations as to why he's crying, and he wept. These are not happy tears; these are sad tears, because he foresaw through Ruach HaKodesh, through divine insight, that she would not be buried with him in the cave of Machpelah. As we know, that the cave of the patriarchs does contain Jacob, does contain Leah, but it does not contain his beloved wife Rachel. Where is Rachel buried? She's buried in Bethlehem, because she died in childbirth with Benjamin. Remember, Rachel had two children. She had Joseph. After a long time of infertility, she was unable to have children. Then she was finally granted Joseph. And then when she was giving birth to Benjamin, she dies in childbirth, and she's buried on the road. She's buried on the way between Ephrath and Jerusalem. She's buried in Bethlehem, and as till today, Rachel's tomb is still a place that that we pray at. We pray at Mother Rachel's tomb, and famously in rabbinic literature and in prophets, she is depicted as the mother who cries on behalf of her children, that when her children are going down to exile and they pass by her on the way from the land of Israel, she cries and God will answer her cries and answer her prayers. I've always been brought up with this memory. Again, parents are online, so it's sort of fun, but my mum always remembers being taken as a girl to Rachel's tomb when her parents, who are both Holocaust survivors, took her to Israel, and clearly no tour of Israel is complete without a visit to Rachel's tomb. And my mother always remembers that there was a mother crying there, holding her daughter with Down syndrome. I think my grandmother remembers this, holding her daughter with Down syndrome against the tomb, crying, Hashem should look after her, Hashem should look after her. Very dramatic place that she's not buried with her husband. She's not buried with her husband. I don't know about you, but I think in my mind there was always there's always a plan. There's a plan to be buried with the person who you married. That's sort of the plan. You don't necessarily think about it when you're under the chuppah, but that is part of what you intend. My other grandmother, my father's mother, so she moved to Israel later on in life to live with my aunt, her daughter, as it wasn't so great for her to stay in Margate, where my grandfather used to be the rabbi, and she was the Rebbetzin, though she'd never called herself the Rebbetzin, and she lived there. And hats off to the Hassels who went to visit my grandfather's shul when they went to Margate recently. There's now a campaign to save the shul, otherwise it's going to become some sort of trendy art gallery or something. But my grandmother used to live in Margate, and it's not so easy to look after a mum who's getting older when she lives in Margate, so she moved with her daughter rather than with us or with her other son in America. So there was always this question that my grandfather's buried in the Margate cemetery, where the rest of the Margate community are buried, and my grandmother was living in Ephrath, quite near to Rachel actually. And so where was grandma going to be buried? So grandma decided that she was going to be buried out there. She didn't want to have to be flown back to England to be buried. She was going to be buried in a plot in the Gush, not far from Rachel. But that was a question, should I be buried with my husband? Should I be buried separate from my husband? So he's crying. The first interpretation is that he's crying because he's not going to be buried with his wife, his beloved wife. He'll be buried with his less beloved wife, but not with his Rachel. Another explanation is he wept because he came with empty hands. What's going on? So here's the Medrash. He thought Eliezer, he came without money. He came penniless. He thought Eliezer, my grandfather's servant, when he went to get my mother Rebecca, he had with him rings and bracelets and all good things, whilst I have nothing with me. I've got nothing. Why has he got no money? Surely mum and dad sent him with some money when he went on his journey. So this was because Eliphaz, who was Esau's son, pursued Jacob by his father's order, to kill him and overtook him. But because Eliphaz had been brought up on Isaac's lap, he withheld his hand. He said to him, but what shall I do? What shall I do as regards my father's order? So Jacob replied, take all that I have, and you can say that I'm dead, for a poor man may be accounted as dead. So there's a backstory here that the sages seem to be telling, that it's not true that Esau just fumed silently away whilst Jacob ran off with the blessings and ran off to Haran. No, it actually, Esau was so filled with murderous intent that Esau sent a dispatch to a kill squad to go and kill his brother. Who was that kill squad? None other than Esau's own son, who was called Eliphaz. However, Eliphaz had, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Eliphaz has been brought up in the home of Isaac, so he can't kill Uncle Jacob. He gets there at night, ready to make the final strike. He can't kill him. So he said to him, what shall I do as regards my... So what can I do? I'm between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, I can't kill you because I was brought up in Isaac's home. On the other hand, my father's told me to kill you. What am I going to do? So he says, take all my money and then I'm dead. Then it's like I'm dead. And so because he came to visit Rachel without any money, any jewelry, any gifts to give her, he cries. Okay, 2 questions here. Where on earth do the sages get that story from about Eliphaz, or about Jacob's despair and not being buried with his wife? And are these 2 explanations similar or different? What do you think? Where do the sages get this from? Are they making it up? And are these 2 explanations the same, different, or otherwise?
So there are 2 references in the commentary to Parashas Rabbah and Devarim Rabbah.
Yeah.
But do those particular passages also have references to where they got them from?
No. So there, Rashi will often, on his commentary on the Torah, quote a medrash as a means to explain what's going on, but the medrash itself doesn't tell you where they got it from. So you could say it's just an oral tradition. That's what happened, or maybe there are textual clues. That's what I'm sort of wondering. First of all, is there a textual clue as to why Jacob's tears would be sad tears rather than happy tears? And the second question is, once we understand there are sad tears, are the sad tears of not being buried with my wife at all similar or different to the sad tears of not having gifts to give my future wife?
They do seem rather different, one would say.
They do seem rather different at first glance. So let's hold those 2 questions in mind, and we're going to see how we can develop this. It might be that by the end of this evening, we'll see that not only are they very similar, but you'll be arguing that as well. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like they're similar at all. 2 different tears of despair. I have no money for you, and we're not going to get buried together. 2 seemingly different things. But let's go into that text. What was the language that was used to describe these tears? Vayisa es kolo vayevk, that he raised up his voice and he cried. Does anyone remember any previous places in the Torah where we've had a character who has raised up their voice and cried?
I think you mentioned it last week. Hagar.
Who was that?
Hagar,
that's right.
Yeah.
Great. So Hagar raises up her voice and cries. What happens over there? So Hagar has been sent out by Abraham, and she settles the baby Ishmael down, because she doesn't want to see him die. It's actually interesting that had she been looking about a little bit better, she would have found the solution to her problem, because she would have found the oasis in the desert, and then she would have been okay. But instead, she puts her baby down and she raises up her voice and she cries. Vatisas kol vatev is the same language that she raises up her voice and she cries. So this expression of raising up one's voice and crying is a vessel of absolute desperation, where all my hopes, all my dreams seem to be slipping through my fingers. It's like, you know, this was my child, this was my connection to the Abrahamic line. Me, Hagar, I'm a princess of Egypt, as we learned in the past. I'm someone who was going to have a connection to royalty. I was someone who's going to be part of the Abrahamic dynasty, and now it's all falling apart, and I'm losing my very child. Everything is just disintegrating around me. So she raises up her voice and she cries. So we know that that's what this word means. Now, is there any other more recent episode where we've had a person raise up their voice and cry? Hagar is telling us what it means, but there's a even more specific expression of a person raising up their voice and crying at a simple loss that all their hopes, all their dreams seem to be disintegrating. Anyone? So I'm going to show you. Oh, Joe.
Yeah, when Esau didn't get his blessing, he raised up his voice, didn't he?
He did. He did.
Oh, that's my wife talking, of course, not me.
Of course.
Yeah, cool.
I wouldn't have thought anything else, Joe. That's fine. So here we are in Genesis 27, verse 38. We're at the end of the deception of Isaac. And it says, Vayomer Esau el Aviv. Esau says to his father, Habracha achas hilacha avi. Do you even have one blessing for me, my father? Barcheni. So bless me, gamani avi. Also bless me too, Dad. He just feels that all his blessings are falling apart. Vayisa Esav kole vayev. And Esau raises up his voice and he cries. The same language. That he's raising up his voice and he's crying is mirrored when Jacob meets Rachel and raises up his voice and he cries. It's almost like the reverberations of the deception are being felt in this moment which could have been happy tears, like Werner said to us, happy, overjoyed, excited tears. I'm under the chuppah, I'm ready to get married, this is going to be my future. I'm already now also sealing the disintegration of my history, of my legacy, of my future, of my happiness, because I caused my brother to cry, so now I will cry. And so these are sad tears. And what's he going to lose? So he's going to lose Rachel. Why is he going to lose? And so if you think about that, there's two ways you can lose Rachel. You can lose Rachel in death, because she's going to die prematurely and I'm going to have to bury her on the way. And you can also lose Rachel in life, because there's going to be someone else, a parent who has two children. A parent who has two children, and there's a desire for one child to be given something special. And instead that parent will, and there's a desire for that one child to be given something special. And there'll be a deception that in the darkness, one child will be switched for the other, in order that there should be a preference given to an older as opposed to a younger. Sounds a bit similar, right? So in the Jacob story, there was a person experiencing darkness, Isaac, who couldn't see, whose eyes were blind. It says, V'chashcha einov, his eyes were darkened, he couldn't see. And in that darkness, there was a deception whereby the order of primogeniture was switched around, whereby the younger took the place of the older. And so too, on a dark night, on the wedding night of Jacob supposedly to Rachel, a father switches round his daughters, whereas Rebecca switched round her sons, and tricks Jacob, putting the older one in place of the younger one. And what's the response? And what's the response of Laban to Jacob when Jacob asks, "What on earth did you just do?" He says, "Lo ya'asein kain bimkomenu." We don't do it in our place. Laseis hatseira lifnei habechira, to put the younger one in front of the older one. We don't put the younger one in front of the older one here in Haran. We go in birth order here. It's the exact response, it's exact opposite. You, Jacob, you're the tricker, you're the trickster. You tricked your father to put the younger before the older. We don't do that here. You have to go for the older first, and then you'll take the younger. So it seems, and so why did that happen? Why was Laban able to get the advantage over Jacob? The reason that Laban was able to get the advantage over Jacob is because Jacob arrived without any money. He was destitute, and so he was ripe to take advantage of. Imagine the situation had Jacob come with all the wealth of his parents' family, all the gold, all the silver, all the jewels, and he'd come in to greedy Laban, and he'd say, "I'd like to marry your daughter Rachel." So Laban would have named his price, and that would have been the end of it. There would have been no switcheroo, no ability to take advantage of him. He would have been in a situation of power. But why did that not happen? Because Jacob caused his brother to cry. When Jacob caused his brother to cry, and the Torah uses exactly the same language for the cry of Jacob when he meets Rachel to the cry of Esau when he loses his blessings. So Esau is now in a position of weakness, in a position of having been tricked and taken advantage of. Esau is the first person to be Jewed down, to be cheated and Jacobed. And so Esau dispatches his son Eliphaz to kill Jacob. He can't kill Jacob, so Jacob thinks, okay, so just take my money, it will be all right. What he doesn't realize is that's actually going to paralyze and cripple. That's going to cripple him in the future. Without money, I'm weak. When I'm weak, I can be taken advantage of. And so the exact trickery that happened to me that I did to my father will now happen to me with my wife's, and I'll lose Rachel on my wedding night, and instead there'll be a switch for Leah.
Quick question.
Yes.
How do we know he left his home with money and gifts?
That's a great question. But we could possibly make an assumption that if his parents are sending him off to get a wife, so there's a good tradition in the Abrahamic household that when you go off to get a wife, you bring money with you. Why? Because we saw that's what happened when Abraham sent Eliezer to go and get a wife for Isaac. He sent Eliezer with all the jewels and all the gifts, and he put them on Rebecca. He put the nose rings and the earrings and the this and the that. So if it's a good family tradition, and that's what they're telling him, go off and to get a wife from Haran, you can imagine that they gave him the means, the dowry, in order to secure an appropriate bride. And the other thing is that Rebecca is essentially sending him to her brother. Sisters know brothers. Yeah, she knows her brother, what her brother wants. He wants money. That's what he wants. So fine. So that's the assumption over there. So what did the sages see? The sages saw in this moment that the Torah has connected the words, raising up his voice to cry, and raising up his voice to cry, that what goes around comes around. Jacob tricks his brother, so he himself is tricked. In the moment of seeming completion, he will cry. He'll cry at the disintegration of his marriage. He'll cry at the disintegration of the integrity of that marriage, because he will not only have Rachel, but he'll have other wives, and he'll not be buried next to Rachel. He's going to lose her prematurely. So you wanted to know, what does God think about deception? God doesn't say anything. God doesn't say you've been a naughty boy. But you see that God has orchestrated some very painful consequences to the initial deception. He himself will be deceived, and he himself will cry. How do we resolve this situation? By the way, okay, so there's two questions now. How do we resolve this situation? But before we get there, I just want to show you one quick parallel, which is a little bit spooky. Okay. So we go back, I want us to go back to Esau's cry. I want us to go back to Esau's cry, because it's not only it's not only Jacob who's going to receive the reverberations of the trickery of his brother. It's even the Jews at a much later stage in history. Kishmoya Esav es divrei aviv, when Esau heard the words of his father, vayitzak tzaka gadola umara, he burst into a wild and bitter sobbing adma'od, very, very greatly. He was absolutely distraught. Vayomer la'aviv, and he said to his father, Barcheni gam ani avi, bless me, also me, my father, bless me. He's beside himself. He's just breaking down. Where else have we heard the words Vayitzak Sa'aka Gedolah Umara? And they let out a great and bitter cry. Where else in scripture have we ever heard such a phrase? So I'm going to share it with you. It's in the Megillah. It's in the Megillah after Haman gives out a decree. Mordechai knows all that's been done. There's been a genocidal decree against the Jews. Vayikra Mordechai es begadov. Mordechai rips his clothes. Vayilbash sak va'efer. And he puts on sackcloth and ashes. Vayetze b'socha'ir. And he goes in front of the city. Vayizak za'aka gedolah umara. And he went and he cries out greatly and bitterly. So once again, he cries out greatly and bitterly. Esau cries out, Vayitzak, now with a tzadi, but it's the same kind of etymology. Vayitzak tza'akat gedolah umara, and he cries out greatly and bitterly. It's the same words. So you want to know what God's commentary is on Jacob's deception? Not only does that commentary tell us that Jacob is going to receive it, but Jacob's descendants are going to receive that pain and that destruction. How are they going to receive it? Well, initially it was Eliphaz, the son of Esau, who was dispatched to kill an individual, to kill an individual, Jacob. Eliphaz failed, but Eliphaz had a child called Amalek, and Amalek had a descendant called Haman, and Haman decided to kill Jew. How do you kill Jew when there's millions or when there's hundreds of thousands of Jews? It can't be just against one person. It's going to have to be a genocidal decree. So you see that the trickery that happened is not only coming to try and just take away the life of Jacob, it's coming to take away the life of Jacob's descendants. That somehow the author of the Megillah is hinting that what goes around comes around, that there's a mute commentary on the moment, on sort of divine consequences that reverberate all the way through to the very end of scripture, in the latest book of scripture, in the book of Esther, that even there we're feeling what it is to be a Jew, to be crooked, and to live for those consequences. There's going to be a genocide. There's going to be pain. There's going to be a cry. You caused Esau to cry. His descendants will cause you to cry. So, how do we resolve this?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, Simon.
Why do I don't understand the references that I've heard about the final redemption of Esau when the Messiah comes. Can you give us the context?
What references are those?
Well, I can't remember the references, but there's this whole sort of concept that not only are all converts descendants of Esau, but there's the redemption of the line of Esau in the time of the Messiah.
So I think we might start to answer your question in the next part. So hold that question, because I think what we have to try and work out is, how do we redeem this? How do we overcome this barrier? You could probably put the question in a different context, but using the imagery that we've spoken about just now. That what happens when the blessings are stolen or taken? So what happens is that one brother cries and the other brother does not cry. And so what we have is mismatched crying. When the blessings are taken, Esau cries. When Jacob meets Rachel, Jacob cries. Esau's not crying. But there's a mismatch of crying. These are two brothers. Let's imagine, who are these two brothers? They're twins. Are these identical twins or non-identical twins? So I had a discussion recently with someone about this, but it seems that when the pregnancy of Rachel is described, it's described that the twins were competing with each other in the womb. So as far as I understand, the only way that twins can actually compete with each other what are they competing for? So it would seem that they're competing for resource. The only time that twins share resource, meaning they share a placenta, is when they're identical twins. Now, we're so used to thinking about Esau and Jacob as looking different, because one comes out all ready and hairy and the other one comes out all a bit limp and not so ready, that we often think of them as non-identical twins. And of course, in all the pictures that we have of sort of like the two of them, which, you know, Yiska comes home from school with sort of these lullaby-like pictures, you've got this sort of big hulking brutish man called Esau and this sort of rather timid but very scholarly looking Jacob. And that's clearly not this case, because even if they were twins, they'd be the same age, and they'd be looking they'd probably be looking relatively similar. They're fraternal twins at least. But here, if they're competing in the womb for a limited resource, that means they share a placenta. That means they are identical twins. So if that's the case, why do they come out looking different? So we have a doctor on the line, or maybe multiple doctors on the line, but I think if you check with an obs and gynae, that sometimes you have a situation whereby identical twins will be differentially competing for the resource from the placenta, meaning one of the babies will get more blood than the other baby, and so one will come out comparatively to the other one more ready, maybe more hairy, maybe more fully formed, and the other one will come out a bit weaker, a bit limper, a bit less capable. And so we have two twins emerging from the womb, identical twins. They look very similar. One's ASAV, one's already made. The other one is not yet there. The other one's trying hard. The other one's holding onto the ankle, is kind of pulling himself along, a bit crooked. So there's darkness and there's an emergence. And when children come out of the womb, we would normally expect them both to cry. That's the sign of a healthy baby. The sign of a baby is that they cry. They come out of darkness and they cry together. There's not a mismatch between the two. There's been two situations of darkness. There's been the darkness of then the subsequent situations of darkness. Isaac, his eyes are dark. There's this dark room. They both go in and one comes out. One comes out with the blessings. The other one comes out crying. But the one, when a baby is born and a baby doesn't cry, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Normally that's a bad thing. If a baby comes out and it's not crying, you rush across and you make sure that they're breathing, because you want the sign of a healthy baby is a baby that cries. So Esau comes out crying, but actually maybe there's Jacob who comes out of this dark room, this darkness, because his father can't see, but he's not crying. So there's something maybe quite strange. There's a new birth, but baby Jacob isn't crying. He's going to have to cry later. There's a mismatch now. So there's a crying of one brother, and there's a crying of another brother. When do they both cry together? When do we finally get a situation where the brothers cry together? And when do we get a situation where Jacob overcomes this slightly crookedness, and becomes straightforward? And so for that, we need to go and think about 3 flocks of sheep. So we said in the verses before that when Rachel we were recounting the story of the meeting of Rachel, there were 3 flocks of sheep. When else are there 3 flocks of sheep that are in a story? The answer is in next week's parasha. Because in next week's parasha, there's a dramatic meeting between Jacob and Esau. Jacob has actually sought out this meeting. Jacob could have gone round. He could have been crooked. He could have, in his return to the land of Israel, not sought out his brother. But the verse specifically comments that Jacob is the one to go and seek out a meeting with Esau. Already, what are you hearing? What are you hearing when Jacob is seeking out to reconcile, to repair with his brother? You're hearing someone who has changed. And so the theory that I want to float to you is that it's not the case that forefather Jacob was born a straight individual, was born true, always holding on to truth. He had to learn the hard way what it meant to live with integrity and to live with honesty. And we're seeing a transformation, and we're going to chart that transformation as he decides to stand up and not be crooked with God, and not be crooked with his brother, and not be crooked with anybody else. He's looked that in the eye. He's looked that defect in the eye, and he's walked away from it. We don't give truth to Jacob simply because he was born all of a sudden this saint. We give truth to Jacob because he's had to learn how to do that. Where do we see three flocks? So we see 3 flocks in the story of Jacob going to make reparations with his brother. Let us have a look at those verses. So we're going to go back into our text. We're in Genesis 32. We're now in the parsha that we're going to be reading in Shul. And let me just see. Yeah, so we're in verses. So he put these flocks in the hands of his servants, eider levado, each flock by itself. Vayomru el avadav, and he says to his servants, Ivru lefanai, go in front of me, v'revach tasimu bein eider le'eider, and put space between each flock and each flock. So how many flocks were there? I'm just trying to find the verse itself, but I just want to, whilst we're here, I want to bring your attention to one word, revach. Revach, space. Let there be space between each flock. You'll find that this word revach, this idea of space, is a very, very rare, word in the Tanakh. And in actual fact, there's only one other place. There's only one other place in Scripture that the word revach, meaning space, is found, and it's over here in Esther. So I'm just drawing another link. So over here in Esther, where Mordechai says to Esther, he says, sorry, I've lost the verse, but he says revach v'hatzala. He says relief, or literally space, and salvation, ya'amod liYehudim, will come to the Jews. He says that to Esther. He says that very word, that there'll be space will come to the Jews. Anyway, so I'm trying to find out is the exact word, the exact verse that tells me that there are three different flocks, and I can't find it right now. But nevertheless, the verse relates to us that there are three different flocks that Jacob takes when he goes to see his brother Esau. He's taking three different flocks with him. Why does the verse tell us there are three flocks? It's linking to the three flocks. It's telling us that there's been a move from the first three flocks to the last three flocks. And in the first three flocks, when he's meeting Rachel, he's still crooked. In the last three flocks, there's been a change. There's been a development. And he takes these flocks and he goes and stands in front of his brother, and he's ready to make reparations. That's what it means to change one's way of doing things, is to stand up straight, to be straightforward, to stand up in front of someone and really own up to the contribution that a person has made. Okay. And how is he straight with God? So there's a difference between the way he relates to God at the beginning of the parasha that we just read and the way he prays to God when he's going to see Esau. So let's just have a quick, I'll say it outside, but when he's talking to God at the time of the ladder, right, he's seen this amazing vision of the ladder, and God says to him, I'm going to look after you, I'm going to take care of you, I'm going to give you all the blessings. So you would normally think that a straightforward response to that would be, thank you so much for looking after me, that's amazing. What does Jacob do in the beginning of the parasha that we just read? He bargains with God. He says, if you do this, then I'll do that. He answers in a very roundabout way, in a bargaining way, in a Jew down stereotypical way. That's how he responds to God. It seems in a very, very strange way in the beginning of last week's parasha. He responds in a roundabout way, not actually offering him a direct thanks, a straightforward thanks, but seeming to bargain, to try and lock God into that promise. Sometimes someone will promise you something and you might want to try and guarantee it. So you start making conditions with them. Oh, that's amazing. Well, let's see how we can make sure that this is going to happen, rather than simply saying thank you. I want us to transport ourselves now into Jacob's shoes as he is about to meet Esau. He's sent messages to Esau that he wants to make a reparation, he wants to make a reconciliation. And the messengers have come back telling him that there are 400 men waiting for him, 400 armed men. And he thinks, what on earth is going to happen now? And he realizes that he's caught in a Holocaust-like decision. There is no easy way out of this because his whole encampment is threatened. There's only one way to ensure any sort of safety, which is to split the encampment. It's almost, the only way that he can ensure any safety is essentially to say, we're going to have to sacrifice one set of children, possibly for the sake of another set of children. It's like the Holocaust story where the SS guard goes to a mother, picks up her baby and threatens to dash its head out on the rocks. And so the mother begs with all her heart, don't take away my child. And so the SS officer grabs the 6-year-old and says, you choose, you can have one. And the mother, who can't make such a horrendous decision, goes mad at that moment because that decision is too horrific to make for any individual. This is the decision that Jacob makes. Jacob is walking into certain death, certain annihilation, as he walks into the hands of the 400 men of his murderous brother, or seemingly murderous brother Esau. And so what does he do? He splits the camp. What would you say to God at that moment? How would you feel? I'd feel pretty angry. If I was to speak to God at that point in time, I'd start bargaining. I'd start being crooked. I'd start saying anything I could. I'd scream. Who can live with such a decision? What is it that Jacob actually says? He's not crooked like he once was. He says instead, Kartonti mikol hachasadim umikol ha'emes. I'm unworthy of all the kindness and all the truth asher asisa es avdecha that you've shown to your servant. Ki b'makli avarti es hayaden hazeh. With my staff alone I crossed this Jordan. Va'ata hayisi l'shnei machanos. And now look, I'm two camps. I'm in two camps. He's saying, you've given me so much. I'm so small and you've given me so much. I came with nothing and now I've got enough. I've got children, I've got wives, I've got flocks. I've got enough for two camps. And then he asks very directly, without any bargaining, Hatzileni no, please save me. Miyad achi, miyad Esav, please save me from the hands of my brother, from the hands of Esau. Ki yare anochi, because I'm afraid of him. I'm worried. Oh, say pen up, yavo v'hikani ema banim, lest he strike me down, mothers and children. Just a small, tiny little point. Hatzilena, please save me. Where else have we heard someone talking about salvation in such a context? We said that Mordechai said, Revach v'hatzala. Sorry, I haven't got the verse. Revach v'hatzala. Space and salvation will come to the Jews, using exactly the same language. That seemingly Mordechai has seen in this moment of straightforwardness of Jacob, evidence that Jacob has turned everything around. Final 5 minutes. How did Jacob turn everything around? How did he become straightforward? How did he speak directly to God? Accepting exactly that situation and asking for direct salvation rather than attempting to bargain. Deciding to face his brother head on. Rather than turning about. And just the final, and whilst we see it worked. How do we see it worked? Because what's the end of their meeting? When Esau meets Jacob, what happens? They greet each other and they both cry. Where are we? First of all, he's coming to him and he calls him Adoni. He says, you're my master. He says, take my offering. I've seen your face and you've received me favorably. He's speaking humbly and directly. Take the blessings that you've given, that has been given to me, that has been given, because God's been gracious to me. I've got everything. He says, take the blessings. What's he saying? I want to make reparations. I took the blessings from you. Take them back. Take them back. And then there's a whole discussion whether they're going to carry on, but they're able to hold each other, to hug each other. And I think, if I can find the right verse, it says that they cry. They cry together. Okay, I can't find it right now, but again, we'll find that verse a little bit later. But so now two children that look like each other are born again, and they're both crying. There is a healthiness. Oh, there it is. Sorry. They kiss each other. Where is it? Vaishakeu vayivku. They run to each other, they greet each other, they hold each other, they fall on each other's necks, they kiss each other, and they cry. Finally, there's been a rectification. They've worked it out. How did Jacob do it? Well, Jacob had a night where he battled with an angel. The angel seems to look exactly like him. Well, that would make sense. These are identical twins. And whether you think the angel is the angel of Esau, or whether you think he's someone else, it doesn't really matter. There's a exchange that goes on between the angel and Jacob. And let's just finish off reading those verses, analyzing them together, and seeing the transformation that this man has made. So Vayakam Bailahu, he got up in that night. Vayikach Eshtein Ashav Eshtei Shechosav, and he takes his two wives and his two maidservants and his 11 children, and he crosses the ford of the Yabok River. And after taking him across the stream, he sent across all his possessions. Vayiverte Yaakov Levado, Jacob is left alone. Vayeavak Ish Imo Ad Alot HaShakar, and a man wrestles with him until the morning. Hold on a second. We've just been told that he's alone. Jacob was left alone. And then we're told that a man was wrestling with him until the morning. So hold on a second. Was he alone? Or was there someone else with him? Maybe he's not really wrestling with another individual. Maybe he's wrestling with himself. Vayara, and he sees, Ki lo yachol lo, he can't overcome him. Vayigal b'kaf yirecho, and he grabs onto his thigh, Vateka kaf yerech, and he strikes his thigh, Yaakov, of Jacob, behevako imo, as he wrestles with him. So if you were writing this sentence, right, let's imagine that your 6-year-old was writing a sentence and you had to correct it so they don't get failed by their teacher in year 2. Let's imagine that there was such a situation where you wanted your 6-year-old to get the right grammar before they go to school. So what would you say about this sentence? And he saw that he couldn't beat him, and he grabbed his thigh and he smacked it. What's the issue with this sentence? Anyone? Come on, Joe, you're an author.
You can't tell who's who. There's too many he's without telling you which he is.
Far too many pronouns. Who's who? Who's the subject? Who's the object? Maybe that's the point. Maybe we don't know who is who because he's fighting himself on some level. And initially there seems to be some sort of roundabout way of trying to overtake him. What's this? I can't beat you, so I'll wound you. That doesn't sound very direct yet. He says, one says, send me away because the sun has come up. It's now light. What does that mean, that it's now light? It was all dark. It was all dark, and there were two people battling with each other. Two people that looked the same who were battling with each other. When have we heard of a story of people battling with each other in the dark who look the same, who maybe are very much similar? We've heard that way back when, in the pregnancy of Rebecca, that she's got 2 children. Who are these children? Identical children, and they're battling with each other for limited resource. What are Jacob and Esau battling with each other for? They're battling for the blessings of this world. They're battling for the blessings of a limited resource. And they're trying to get the better of each other. And now the sun has come. Well, if we follow that metaphor on, if the sun has come, that means it's time to give birth. It's time for them to emerge. What happened last time these 2 brothers emerged? One was called Esau, fully formed, fully grown, a doer. The other seemed to get a rather derogatory term, a name that his mother wasn't happy to give him. She's left out from giving him that name. His name is Jacob. What happens now? I won't let you go unless you bless me. We need to have blessing in this childbirth moment. So he says to him, what's your name? Hold on a second. You just asked for a blessing, and the response was, what's your name? There doesn't seem to be any connection between the request for a blessing and the question, what's your name? Unless that's really the point. You want something from me, but you have it yourself. What's your name? Vayomer Yaakov, and he says, my name is Jacob. We're going to get a repeat of the story unless something else can happen, something more straightforward. Vayomer lo Yaakov yema od. Your name will not be Jacob anymore. Shimcha ki im Yisrael, unless rather it will be Israel. Because you fought with God and with people and you prevailed. You fought your nature in your relationship with God, in your relationship with others, and you prevailed. You're not going to be called Jacob anymore. You're not going to be called Mr. Crooked. You're going to be called Mr. Yisrael, like Yashar Kel, like God is straight. God is that you are the straight one of God, that you've somehow turned yourself around. And then what does Jacob call this name? Shem HaMakom Peniel. He calls the place the face of God. Ki ra'isi Elohim panim panim, because I saw God face to face. Latinetzel nafshi, and my life has been preserved. If you're doing things in a straightforward way, how do you relate to people? You relate to people face to face. So let's put it all together. It seems like there was a deception of Isaac, a deception that caused one brother to cry and another brother to prevail. It caused Esau to cry and for Jacob to prevail. We asked, what does God feel about all this? God seems to be sending reverberations of that deceit throughout the life of Jacob. We see that when he first meets his beloved Rachel, that he sees that that life is going to disintegrate. He won't be buried with her. Not only will he not be buried with her, but he doesn't have anything to offer her. And so he gets thrown into his own situation of trickery, where Laban says, we don't do that in our place. We don't put the old one before the younger one. So we don't put the younger one before the older one. Once again, he'll be tricked because of the trickery that he did. That trickery will reverberate throughout Jewish history, even to the times of the Purim story. And yet there's a confidence and there's a change, because these brothers, these two people, these identical twins who emerged from a single location, a place of darkness, will come again and will emerge again from a place of darkness, and they will cry together, and they will resolve and reconcile their differences. How do people reconcile their differences? They don't do it in a crooked way. They do it by facing up to each other, face to face, straight talking, looking at each other in the eye, and one saying to the other, I am sorry, and then finally crying together. Jacob is able to strive for truth and achieve what it means to be a person of truth. How do I feel about the moniker of being the Jew? Well, I think the answer is that being a Jew doesn't mean that you always get it right. Being a Jew means that you struggle and you try and you fail, but you struggle again, like a Yisrael, ki sarisa im Elokim im anashim batucha. You struggle with God, you struggle with other people, but eventually you prevailed. That's what it means to be a Jew. It doesn't mean that we always get it right, but it means that we try at all times to hold that moral compass in place. And just leave you with food for thought before I open up for more reflections, which is, if this is the case, that Jacob is finally able to transform himself into the man of truth, so much so that Mordechai, using the same language of this week's parsha, can confidently assert that they will win against the scion of Esau, against the scion of Eliphaz, against the scion of Amalek. They'll win against Haman. He can assert with confidence that truth will prevail. Then why does Jacob's life still fall apart after this point in time? Why does Jacob lose his beloved Joseph, lose his beloved Benjamin? Why is he sitting a depressed and broken wreck for most of his life? Surely the story should end now. Surely we have redeemed his mistake. What on earth went wrong? Join us next time as we chase away the lullabies on Chasing Lullabies. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Any comments and questions, very, very much welcome now.
I have a question. So if he's going down this line of truth, why does Jacob immediately deceive Esau again? Because Esau says, I'll see you in the Seir, and Esau goes off and Jacob goes off in the opposite direction. That's not a man of truth.
That's a good question. It's interesting because he does actually see a sort of philosophical divide between himself and Esau that can't be overcome. That as just as an example, Esau says, Yeshli Rav, I've got so much, but there's always more. Jacob says, Yeshli Kol, I've got everything, and I'm entirely satisfied with my lot in this world. There is a sort of a fundamental difference in the way they relate to having, to this world, to what it means to have success, that doesn't seem to be compatible. And Esau sort of says, let me come with you. Let's all get together. Let's be one big happy family. And Jacob sees a real threat to his family's philosophy and integrity if they will carry on. It's not an entire answer to your question, but he sees something that is going to threaten his ability to be a forefather of the Jewish people if their camps are going to mix. And so there seems to be some rationale for moving apart. But you're right. That's a good question. Why he's not straightforward. No, we're not going to carry on together, and that's it. We're done. It's a good question.
Skipped over the dots in 33 for
Right. The dots there are because there's so Jonathan's asking that in the Torah itself, if you have a quick look, just put it up. There's an interesting and rather unique presentation of how Esau meets up with his brother. So he says Vayishakehu, and he kissed him, and there's dots over the word Vayishakehu. That's how it's presented in the Torah. There's these little dots. So Rashi over here already tells us that the dots are there to tell us that this kiss might not have been entirely wholehearted. Dots are placed above the letters of this word, and a difference of opinion is expressed in the Medrash again as to what these dots are intended to suggest. Some explain that the dotting is meaning that he did not kiss him with his whole heart. Whereas Rosh ben Yochai said, is it not well known that Esau hated Jacob? But at that moment, his pity was really aroused and he kissed him with his whole heart. So there's a dispute whether there's some sort of tension underneath this reconciliation that it's not entirely full. If anyone's ever tried to make a reconciliation with somebody else, you will know that it's not the easiest thing. That you can stand there and you can say sorry, and you can try your hardest to put the past behind you, but there's still little infections of the past in that present moment at times. That maybe we're not quite fully reconciled, but we're just going to make the best of the situation. So there is that real tension in their reconciliation. How full is it? How much does Esau want it? But for that could be another sort of insight there. Yeah.
Just racking my brain back to a previous share on that subject. I could have this completely wrong, so I apologize if I have, but is there a midrash or something that when they fell on each other's necks, Esau went to bite Jacob to kill him and Jacob's neck turned to stone and they wept because Esau was in pain and Jacob wept because what he was trying to achieve hadn't worked?
Yeah.
You mean he's really Luis Suarez?
Yeah.
Yeah, we see that tension, I think, throughout that maybe it's not a full reconciliation, maybe it's not really quite what we'd hope for. Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say is, again, I could be completely wrong on this, is it not that when Leah married Jacob, she also cried because she wasn't able to fulfill her marriage to Esau, which was pre-planned? And
well, I think the Medrash says it the other way around, that she recognized that the older goes to the older and the younger goes to the younger. So who's she going to end up with? She's going to end up with Esau. That's not so great if you're a sensitive and God-fearing young lady. You kind of want the righteous person. You don't want the hunter who goes around murdering and raping. So she was crying because she thought she was going to get stuck with Esau. So that's why it's describing her eyes as being soft. Yeah. Just
to answer the twins thing, it is more than possible to have non-identical identical twins. It's really monozygotic rather than identical. So if the gene expression is not quite the same at the hair color bit or the eye color bit, then you can, either through mutation or through expression, have differences. It's not common, but you can have a ginger and a brown hair colored identical twins.
That's great, because the question that someone asked me on this is that when Jacob protests against his mother's plan to go in, he says, my brother Esau is really hairy and I'm quite smooth skinned. So I thought maybe that's an attack on this assumption that they are placenta sharing identical twins, but this would suggest that there's sufficient genetic variability and maybe married with environmental variants that will allow one to be a bit hairier than the other one. So,
but isn't it also the case that Rachel didn't have a womb at all, which is why she
again this is a medrash again that she there was entirely miraculous. She was sterile, essentially, that there was nothing there to deal with. Yeah. It's interesting. Just Simon Hassel. When we learn these, and a few of you quoted medrashim. My wife always has this sort of tension that when she was brought up that all the stories, all the midrashim became as if they were the text itself, as if the Torah text was saying these things, And when she actually read the Torah as an independent learner for the first time, she was sort of disappointed and also quite shocked that all these midrashim that she'd learned as if they were exactly what happened. Where did it happen? Where was it that Abraham was thrown in the fiery furnace, or that Esau's neck turned to stone, or whatever it was? Where are all these stories? And I suppose what we're trying to show in this evening's Chasing Lullabies as a sort of a meta idea is that these midrashim don't come from nowhere, that the sages link together intertextuality. They look at the textual piece in this verse and the textual piece in that verse, that Vayisas kol vayef, he raises up his voice and he cries. And there's a reason that God has put together this Jacob's crying at Rachel's meeting Rachel, and that crying where Esau is crying because he's lost the birthright, and also he's lost the blessings. And so it's almost like the sages fill in the gaps that the text itself has told them to fill in, has instructed there is a link, and so he's filling in the gaps with these midrashim. So I suppose it's an inductive way to midrash rather than a deductive way. Is we're trying to get, well, rather it's the other way around. We're trying to deduce midrash from the text rather than induce text from midrash. So that would be, I think, a different way to think about how to relate to text and midrash.
Looking at the Megillah to say what was happening in Bereshis. So there's a 1,000-year difference between the two.
I know, it's amazing.
I can understand looking forward, but not backwards in time.
I'm looking at the Megillah to see reverberations of Bereshis in Esther, and to see Mordechai's confidence, which tells us that he understood something had happened way back in Bereshis that we might not have been alerted to. It's almost like Mordechai's response is teaching us something about how to see the text over there in Genesis. If he saw it like that, so too we can see it like that. My friends, thank you so much for logging in. This was such an amazing evening. I will see you very soon, please God. Anyone who wants to book to come to shul, you're more than welcome. Anyone who wants to stay on Zoom, you're more than welcome. And we'll see you very soon, please God. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.